So my name is Ethan Tapper. I'm the Chittenden County Forester. If we haven't met before, welcome. County Foresters are, there's 13 of us for Vermont's 14 counties, and our job is to help the owners of private lands, privately owned forested lands, manage their forests more responsibly. And so there's a whole bunch of different parts to that. We manage this program called the Current Use Program. The Use Value Appraisal Program is its official name. We're a resource for landowners with forested land of any size, from a couple acres to thousands of acres. We help towns manage their town forests, and we also, more broadly, sort of think about how to improve the quality of the health of forests and the quality of forest management in our counties. How do we address threats that are unique to our counties, and how do we sort of meet our counties with the forests and the ecosystems and the people that we have? And so a big challenge to a lot of the work that we do, and more in some counties than others, is this question of how do we deal with invasive plants? I hear about this all the time. I do a lot of work with this program called the Backyard Woods Program. If you haven't heard of it, check it out. It's for landowners who own less than 25 acres of forested land to learn how to manage their land more responsibly. And, you know, sure enough, I'll be doing a meeting with the Backyard Woods Program, and someone will say, you know, my woods just looks really brushy. And what that means is usually you have an invasive plant problem. So this is one of the few cases, when dealing with invasive plants, is one of the few cases when you actually get to clean your forest up, and it's a good thing to do. I tell people that forests are supposed to be messy all the time, but this is a situation where you can do a bunch of work and kill a bunch of invasive plants and, you know, really protect the biodiversity of your forest and make it look tidier, which I'm like, it's very satisfying because I never get to do that. And so the way that I'm going to organize this presentation is that I'll sort of talk about invasives in general, what they are, what they're like, why they're so prolific, and why they're such a threat to our biodiversity. I'm going to go through identifying some of the common invasive plants that we have in Vermont, so you have sort of some tools for what to look for. And then I'm going to talk about specific or general treatment strategies. And then if we have time, we'll talk about specific treatment strategies. So which one of these strategies is appropriate for which individual species? And I'll try and give a lot of examples of that. With all this stuff, you have options. There's not one thing that's appropriate. There's stuff that I've realized that works a lot better. But with any given species, there are different options that depend on, you know, what you want to invest and the individual species in question, you know, what their traits are, what they're like, how they work. So without further ado, I will share my screen and I'll start this baby up. Alrighty. Dealing with non-native, aka exotic, invasive plants in your forest. That's me, Ethan Tapper, the Chittenden County Forester. I work for the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. Ethan.tapper@vermont.gov, or you can search for Chittenden County Forester, and it'll pop right up if you want to get a hold of me. So what are invasive exotic plants? So when we call them exotic or non-native, it just means that they're plants or animals or pathogens, pests, outside of their native range, right? They're not native to here. And, you know, how we call something native, you know, is a whole other discussion that we don't really need to get into for this. In this case, these are plants that have been introduced by humans recently, like in the last few hundred years, into this area, into an area that they were previously not native to. Invasive is a subjective term. It's similar to the term pest. Basically, it means that they're doing something that we don't want them to do. In this case, for my presentation, I consider what is invasive to be, hold on one second here. I consider invasive to be something that is harmful to our ecosystems and to our biodiversity. So I don't care about, I'm not thinking about it in terms of timber. I'm not thinking about it in terms of specific wildlife species or crops or anything like that. I'm just thinking about ecosystems and biodiversity, and that's how we term if something's invasive or not invasive. Of Vermont's 2,800 plant species, about 600 are introduced. So those are most of our field species and also stuff like apple trees. Most are not invasive. But there are a few that just have that, you know, that are introduced, and they have whatever trait, the specific suite of traits that it takes to become very aggressive and to invade our ecosystems in a way that's harmful. Oh, back. So what are they like? So they share these specific traits among almost all invasive plants. Almost all of them are fast spreading. Almost all of them are generalists. So that means that they can persist in a wide range of different environments. Some of our native species are like really closely associated with certain sites. You know, sugar maple, for example, mostly grows on what we call rich sites, sites that are rich in calcium and magnesium and some of these other trace minerals. Invasives can grow kind of anywhere. Many of them are allelopathic. What that means is that they are injecting chemicals into the soil that are in some way inhibiting the growth of other plants. They're allelopathic in a bunch of different ways. Actually, most plants are allelopathic in some way, but they're really allelopathic. And some of them have some really diabolical allelopathic strategies, like garlic mustard, for instance, injects a chemical into the soil that inhibits the growth of mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi is a fungus that is associated with the roots of a tree and has a mutualistic relationship with them where they basically trade resources. And most trees and plants require mycorrhizal fungi in order to grow. And garlic mustard doesn't. And so one of their strategies for dominating an area is to kill all the mycorrhizal fungi, and then garlic mustard is the only thing that can survive. Most of these species also seed prolifically. They produce berries that are often spread by animals. And in that way, they're able to sort of carpet the landscape. And most of them are also really good at sprouting. So they're resilient, they're hard to kill. They're skilled at what we call layering. So some of them, like a Japanese knotweed, can grow from like an 1.5 inch long section of cane, any piece of the plant, which is a really good adaptation if you're a species like knotweed and you get transported on floodwaters. You know, you grow in these floodplains, and then floodwaters come in the spring and wash pieces of knotweed everywhere, and each one of those pieces can create a new plant. They're just really good at staying alive. They're actually, you know, just from a purely, you know, what I learned as sort of like metabolic fitness level, like how good they are at just like being alive and reproducing and all this stuff, what it means to be an organism, they're pretty impressive. Some of them are really impressive. But the reason for that is because they're existing outside of their range, and they're existing independent of predators, parasites, and environmental factors that constrain them in their natural habitat. So there's a great book called The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert, where she talks about invasives. You know, she's talking about major biodiversity threats across the world that's causing these mass losses of biodiversity. And she talks about invasives as organisms that are essentially released from their evolutionary constraints. So when an organism is evolving, it's not evolving in relationship with every organism in the world or every site in the world. It's just evolving in relationship with the few organisms and the sites that are local to it, the conditions that are endemic to the area where it lives. And so for that reason, you know, you don't have every organism in the earth that's adapted to deal with every other organism in the earth. You end up with some weird stuff like the fact that in New Zealand has no native land mammals, right, except bats. And when there were like rats and livestock introduced to New Zealand, it completely wreaked havoc with their native biodiversity because they just weren't ready for that. They couldn't handle it. And to a lesser extent, that is true with these invasive exotic plants. They're interacting with our landscape in a way that is novel, and the normal constraints of their native environment are not present. And so they're just like completely released from their evolutionary constraints. So why do we care, right? The simplest way to express this is that we care because these plants are displacing our native species. We need to develop, in general, a more complex way of thinking about our ecosystem. So like a forest is not just a bunch of trees, right? A forest is this, what I call like a volume of life. It's trees, but the trees are like the coral in a coral reef. So if you think about a coral reef, you wouldn't think about, you know, the coral's the only thing that matters. It's this incredible, you know, mass of life that's swarming around the coral, which is this living structure, much like these trees. And so in addition to the stuff that's obvious to us, there are all these different relationships, organisms that cohabitate with one another, and these processes that are really, really important to the way that our ecosystems function. And by displacing our native species, these invasive plants are interrupting those processes. That is much more dire in a world, which I'm going to talk about in a second, where humans have introduced all these other stressors, which are stressing our ecosystems out all the time, and invasives are sort of just another thing on top of all that. There are acute impacts of invasive plants, so that's stuff like they prevent, they have lower invertebrate densities than our native plants, so lower amounts of bugs that are foraged for by some of our native bird species by a factor of like 20. They have less nutritious seeds and fruits, so birds are foraging on their seeds, getting ready for their seasonal migration, and they're not able to store as much nutrition in their bodies and be as fit heading into that migration because they're foraging on invasive plants instead of native plants. But what is really concerning to me is not those acute impacts as much as sort of the way that they disrupt ecosystems in general as systems. And so in a global context, excuse me, in a global context, along with habitat loss and climate change, biological invasions, so invasions of living species, are considered a major threat to global biodiversity by everybody. Invasive organisms account for about half of all extinctions, of which the cause is known. And according to the National Wildlife Federation, about 42% of endangered species are primarily threatened by invasives. That is mostly invasive animals, but also invasive plants and pests and pathogens as well. The species that you're seeing on the left there, the brown tree snake, is another one of those examples where this is just a species that was introduced in Guam, and it caused, I think now functionally extinct are all 12 of the native bird species in Guam. Again, just because this is a species that is suddenly taken out of its native environment, outside of its native constraints, and put in a novel environment where those bird species don't know how to deal with it. We also care about invasives because, again, we're living in an extremely altered landscape in the midst of what we call global change. So climate change is a really severe and intense threat, but we need to consider that climate change is also combined with all these other human-caused stressors that are impacting our ecosystems all the time. And when we combine all those, we call them global change. So what global change is climate change plus altered natural disturbance regimes, invasive exotic plants, animals, pests, pathogens, forest loss, conversion, fragmentation, pollution, and more. We can add to that in Vermont the fact that our forests are less complex, much less complex than they have been for thousands of years, because almost all of them were clear cut in the 1800s. There are many other stressors on our ecosystems that sort of all build up to be this incredibly, whereas one thing, maybe our ecosystems could be resilient to it. With all these things combined, it's just an incredible amount of stress on our ecosystems. We also care about it because globally, we're losing biodiversity at an alarming rate. So again, I mentioned that book, The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert. That's a really great resource. In addition, we're in a time that we call the Anthropocene, right? So that's a geologic era in which humans are the dominant influence on our climate and on our ecology. And we're touching basically every ecosystem on Earth in profound ways. We're in the middle of a massive constriction of biodiversity. One of the most alarming stats that I've seen is the fact that I used to think that this was 50%. It turns out it's actually 68%. Global animal populations are 68% lower than they were in 1970. That means that there are 68% less animals on the planet, not 68% less species, but 68% less physical animals on the planet than there were 50 years ago. We're experiencing extinction rate at a rate that's somewhere between 10 and 10,000 times the background rate. It's hard to know because about 97% of all the species on Earth are invertebrates, bugs, and most of them we can't even see. We think that about 1 million animal and plant species are threatened with extinction right now. That's 40% of all amphibians, about 33% of corals, a third of all marine mammals. We know that 680 vertebrate species have been driven to extinction since the 16th century, around the time that Europeans started to colonize this continent. And that we're just losing biodiversity within our ecosystems at just a really scary rate. That picture in the background is a species that's called eastern elk, which is actually a forest-dwelling elk that we used to have here until the 1700s. one of our large native ungulates, but is now extinct. We also care because forests literally make it possible for us to live. So forests are producing, I mentioned that what we county foresters do is support landowners, people who own forested land. And I don't think I mentioned that 80% of all the forests in Vermont are privately owned. And those forests are contributing massively to our lives and our quality of life. So they're cleaning our air, producing air, cleaning water, providing wildlife habitat for all of our wildlife, providing most of the habitat for our pollinators, including the pollinators of our food crops, mitigating floods, attenuating floods, preventing erosion, regulating our weather and our climate, making Vermont a beautiful place to live in, providing the site for outdoor recreation, which is an incredibly huge industry in our state, $3 billion industry. They are just this incredibly, and most, I should say, most of those benefits are actually flowing from private lands. And so the ability of forests and other ecosystems to produce those benefits is a function of their ability to function. And these invasive plants are, believe it or not, are a massive threat to their ability to do that in the long term. And we care because biodiversity matters. So as an ecosystem manager, we care about biodiversity because biodiversity is what allows our forests and other ecosystems to be resilient and to be adaptive, to adapt to the massive changes in our landscape, and to be resilient to them. Resilience means the ability of the forest to withstand change and stress while maintaining its overall health and function. And the more diverse forests are, the more adaptable and the more resilient they are. And the more infested with invasive plants they are, generally, the less diverse they are. And it just really throws a wrench into their this amazing system that forests have of being resilient and of changing over time and of just becoming more and more complex over time. For wildlife, it's a threat to their habitat because they're displacing native species that our native wildlife have associations with, relationships with. And again, some of those acute problems like producing less valuable fruit, having less invertebrate density, stuff like that, which trickles up the food web. For humans, again, the ability of forests to produce those public resources is a function of their ability to be healthy. And also, I always say intrinsically. So I think that all of our species have the right to exist and that they don't have to give us anything. They're just important because they exist. And that what we're seeing with these invasive plants is that they're fundamentally threatening native species that have the right to exist. All right, so how do we identify them? So you don't have, there's a lot of different invasive plants. One thing that I do with landowners a lot of times is that, we'll go out walking in the woods, and if they're not comfortable with tree identification, I'll do what I call like the triage. So I'll say, okay, you don't have to learn all the species in Vermont, the 200 species that are in your book. You just have to learn these 5, because these 5 tree species are most of the tree species in your woods. And by the way, there are 10 tree species in Vermont that comprise about 85% of all the tree species in the state. So if you want to learn to identify trees, learn those 10 trees and then add some more trees in as you go. As far as invasives, your ability to deal with these species is going to be a function of your ability to identify them in many cases. And it's pretty crazy sometimes if you show people, you teach them to identify an invasive plant and suddenly they're like, oh my God, it's everywhere. It's throughout my woodlot. Your ability to deal with invasives quickly and before it becomes a problem gives you way more tools for dealing with it, just way more options, and it's going to cause less negative impacts to your ecosystem. So identifying them is really important. The 6 invasive plants that I see the most are these 6. Shrub honeysuckle, Linicera is its Latin name. Common buckthorn, Ramus cathartica. Japanese barberry, Berberis. There's also a European barberry. You can just call them both barberry. Asiatic bittersweet, also called Oriental bittersweet. Glossy buckthorn, which does not actually look that similar to common buckthorn, which used to be, I learned as Rhamnus cathartica, but now I learned as Rhamnus frangula, but now it's Frangula alnus, also called alder buckthorn. And multiflora rose, Rosa multiflora. So those are the big ones. And in most of the places that I go, and if you go in different parts of the state, which ones are common is a little bit different. But those are the ones that I see by far the most. And of those, I see shrub honeysuckle, common buckthorn, Japanese barberry 99% of the time. Okay. And we're going to talk about how to identify those. Less common, but still around, are autumn olive and Russian olive, black swallowwort, which is also called dog strangling vine, which I guess is very common in like the Woodstock area, and I've seen it in Charlotte, but not as common yet. I think it's on Lincoln Hill and Heinsberg as well, for you Heinsbergers. And burning bush is a species. I grew up in the Connecticut River Valley down in Saxon's River, and burning bush is pretty prominent down there. Other non-woodies to be aware of: Japanese knotweed, you're going to see mostly by people's houses, sometimes by old foundations and stuff like that, and alongside streams. Phragmites is that one with that big tassel that you see by the side of the road all the time and in wetlands, sort of like creeping across and totally wiping out the cattails. Garlic mustard is one that is fairly common. And then also, Tim asked me to mention some field ones as well. Ones that you might see in a field are, especially poison parsnip is one that people are talking about right now. That's not one I deal with as much because it's not in the woods, it's in a field. Chervil, which looks a lot like Queen Anne's lace. And some people are really concerned about a species called spotted knapweed, which actually has a really pretty pink flower, but is really, really aggressive. You can get details on how to identify all these at vtinvasives.org, which is a state-run website, which is just about invasive plants, or I'm sorry, just about invasive species. Okay, so shrub honeysuckle. It's a shrub. It's not going to be more than 6 feet tall. It's going to have multiple stems branching right close to the ground. What I notice in here is these leaves that they have no toothing, they have no serration at all. They're just like the picture that a child would draw of a leaf, just a perfect leaf. And they're joined to the stem at a perfect 45-degree angle. The buds are also coming off at a perfect 45-degree angle opposite one another. Okay, that's what the buds look like. Perfect 45-degree angle. The stems are really brittle, so you can just crack them, and they are slightly hollow. They do have a brown pith. The hollow pith is a trait for telling the non-native honeysuckle from the native honeysuckle. But a lot of people get really concerned that they're going to pull up native honeysuckle, and what I would say is that I see non-native honeysuckle literally 1,000 times a year, and I see native honeysuckle like once or twice a year. I did a walk years ago at Mob's Farm, which hopefully tonight we'll be voting on being conserved by the town of Jericho. And Liz Thompson was there. Liz is a really amazing ecologist and resource our community. She works for the Vermont Land Trust. And I was saying that, and I said, yeah, I never see native honeysuckle. You don't have to worry about it. And she said, isn't that native honeysuckle right there? So I guess I should be careful, but native honeysuckle is not brittle. It's much more pliable and bendy. And its pith is white. That's what the leaves look like. The underside of the leaves are much lighter in color. They're slightly woolly. That's what it looks like, just sort of a cruddy, shrubby thing that you've probably seen on the side of the road. You've probably seen it on the edge of your yards. That's what it looks like. Oh, golden shreddy bark is another really good characteristic. It also has red berries. There were 2 huge honeysuckles at the end of my driveway when I was growing up, and I think we called them poison berries, which was a conflation of boysenberries. That red berries that you're not supposed to eat, and these showy white, pinkish, or yellowish flowers in the spring. This was an ornamental plant that was planted largely for that flower. And pollinators like them; they use them. You'll see when the flowers are out, bees and stuff buzzing around. All right, common buckthorn. Everything about buckthorn is black. They have black bark, they have black buds, they have black berries, they just look black. And so this is a crummy picture, obviously, but what you'll see with the buds is that they are often sub-opposite. So they'll be almost opposite one another on the stem, but they'll usually be just a little bit off. And why they're called buckthorn, they don't have true thorns, but sometimes on the end of the twig, they'll have this little prickle. So just a little teeny prickle on the end of the twig. Their distinctive trait, to my eyes, is their leaves. So they have these dark, glossy leaves that have this specific kind of vein structure. So it's called arcuate venation. And what that means is you just have these veins that come out and they parallel the margin of the leaf, and then they come back in towards the middle. It's very, very distinctive. And then you have parallel veins on the inside. The leaves of most trees jut out to the outside just like that, just like ribs sort of, but these ones go out and then they come back in towards the tip. Deeply embossed in the leaf, very, very distinctive. And when they are mature, like in the middle of the summer, they'll be very dark and glossy. Clusters of blackberries, very, very distinctive. Buckthorns there are male buckthorns and female buckthorns, so not all of them will produce berries. But when they do produce berries, they'll produce them in this big clusters, and they're actually a diuretic, or they give animals diarrhea. So sometimes you'll see like a bunch of cedar waxwings eating buckthorn berries, and there'll be like black splotches all around the tree because gives them all the runs. This is what they look like when they're bigger. People mistake them a lot for wild apple trees because they have that sort of low branching trait, and they have that they can have peely, shaggy bark. Their bark is blackish, shaggy when they get bigger, sort of more of a black metallic when they're younger or higher up in the tree. And I've actually seen people manicure around these trees and tend around these trees thinking that they're apple trees, but they're not. These were actually planted we think, as a living fence. So people planted them as like a hedgerow tree so they wouldn't have to maintain their fence line as much. I thought that these were not in Vermont until like mid-early 1900s, but then at the Catamount Community Forest, we found one that was 120 years old. So that really threw a wrench into what my timeline was. Japanese barberry, this is the one that I've been really struggling with on my own land in Bolton. So the leaves are teardrop shaped. So you can see here, they have this little tail and they come out bulbous and then come back into the stem here. They grow in these little clusters. Under each one of these clusters will be a single bud, and under that bud will be a single thorn. Just like that, this needle-like thorn that gets stuck in your hand, and it swells up and it makes you crazy for days when you try and pull these things out. They have these very distinctive berries that you could probably see right now. They'll hang on to them in the winter sometimes, that to my eye are shaped like little red Tic Tacs. The foliage of Japanese barberry turns bright red, and these berries are persistent, which is one of the reasons why I think it was planted as an ornamental in the first place. You can still see a lot of barberry plants planted in people's front yards. That's what they look like when they get really well advanced. At my place in Bear Island, I had my property that I call Bear Island. We had probably 10 acres of this, just waist high, nothing but this in the understory of the forest. And so one of the other attributes that is sometimes galvanizes people in a different way to deal with these species is that specifically barberry attracts higher densities of ticks. It's thought that they basically, because they produce these really dense structures with these thorns and stuff, that they create a safe space for mice. And so then the mice bring the ticks in. And so there is a very strong correlation between areas with Japanese barberry infestations and increased tick density. Oriental Bittersweet, which I think we're calling Asiatic Bittersweet now, Celastrus or Biculatus. It's a vine, so it's the only vine that we've talked about. Wraps around trees. Occasionally, it'll look all crazy like this, and it'll make the tree sort of do this like spiral thing where the tree will kind of like heel around it. Very, very distinctive, smooth, light brown, yellow bark. The other vine that you're going to see that can get this big is usually wild grapevine, and wild grapevine has brown, shreddy bark. So very, very different to this light brown bark, which will never be shreddy. That's what it makes the trees do when they sort of heel around. You guys have probably all seen this. the berries are persistent. So I grew up in a house where there was a wreath of these berries on our front door every year. And every year, you know, you'd have that wreath up and pretty red berries. And then when you're done with it, what do? You chuck it over the bank. And that's definitely a source of spreading Oriental Bittersweet. When they get dense, they can appear to coat trees. So if you just drive down one of our highways, you start getting close to the Massachusetts border, you'll start to see trees like this. And one of the reasons why it's there is that, you know, there are foresters that I work with who are not old, who are in their 50s, and remember planting this species along power lines and along highways. And the idea was that the bittersweet was going to keep sort of pull everything down, keep everything down. Pretty crazy stuff. And this is one of the species that I'm really, really freaked out about. I haven't dealt with it that much. And then on my own land, had to deal with it. And it is unreal how resilient it is and how much seed it produces. Another interesting note was that we have a yearly, except for last year, we have a yearly county forester retreat, or summit, as I like to call it, where we visit one of the counties and, you know, we get shown around. And we went to Windham County a few years ago, and there was a guy there who just decided that he was gonna clean up this park that was totally infested with invasive plants, and he had a lot of time, and he decided he was gonna do it all by digging them up. And he dug up a Oriental Bittersweet vine that had a root that was 100 feet long. And he knows because he dug the whole thing that just went along it little by little, little by little by little. And then he showed it to us when we were there. It was pretty incredible. This is another one that's sort of on my watch list, one that is very common in the Connecticut River Valley, increasingly common in parts of Chittenden County. Not sure how common it is in other parts of the state, but definitely is a up-and-comer that's starting to freak me out. It has these buds that are naked, and I say it looks like Tintin's hair. It's sort of this reddish gold, little just like flip of a naked bud. It has also glossy leaves with that arcuate venation, similar to the common buckthorn. But its bark is very different. So remember, common buckthorn had that really shaggy or shiny black bark. This bark is more of this sort of purplish color with these little white dots all over the place. Those blackberries will not be born in clusters, but will occur singly like that. And sometimes when I see them, like I'll be driving down the highway and I can tell when I'm seeing glossy buckthorn because it'll be like one main stem and then this whizzled bunch of wavy sprouts sticking out from the bottom. This was another species that was planted as an ornamental and I think a little bit for planted as a wildlife species. There was this trend not that long ago where we thought that we could provide better wildlife species by introducing some new plants, new shrubs, and some of them like Russian olive and autumn olive became invasive. And glossy buckthorn is another one that was planted like that. Okay, so again, I mentioned that to identify these different species, you can download information sheets on them from vtinvasives.org. There's also an app called Inaturalist, which is really, really cool. So Inaturalist is an app that uses artificial intelligence to tell you what a species is, and it works across all different species. So it's not just shrubs or plants. It's also, you can do it with insects, you can do it with trees. It'll use artificial intelligence to tell you what a given plant is. And if it can't do that, it basically puts it out to this really dedicated network of naturalists and ecologists and different people in the state who will really quickly get back to you and tell you what it is, just by you like taking a picture of a leaf or something. So that's a cool tool that you can bring with you. And it's a fun thing to play with anyway, but you can bring with you and learn a lot from that as well. All right, so one thing that's really important, there's all this sort of interesting ways that we need to think about how to deal with invasive plants. One thing to consider is that eradication, complete eradication from our landscape of any of these plants is not a real option. Never going to happen. What we need to do is we need to achieve a level of control. And how I define control is that there are populations that are low enough that they're not meaningfully impacting our biodiversity. On an individual property level, what that means is that when there's a new honeysuckle or a new buckthorn or a new whatever that pops up on your land, you know how to identify it and you pull it out before it becomes a problem. There's no future in which we're not going to have to be actively engaged with these species and controlling them actively. But it's just important to recognize that this is just something that we're going to have to be dealing with, and so that's one of the reasons why identification is so important. So one thing that I think about, and I think about this with forest management, which is most of the work that I do too, is think about, you know, Robin Wall Kimmerer in the amazing book Braiding Sweetgrass talks about how in Western culture, when we purchase a piece of land, we think about having a bundle of rights. We have the right to cut the timber, and we have the right to develop it, and we have the right to mine it, and all these other things. But we should also think about how we have what she calls a bundle of responsibilities. So do we not have some responsibility to keep our land healthy? And in the case of invasive species, it's like, this is a problem that we 100% caused. And so where I take a lot of my motivation for wanting to deal with the problem is not just because I love ecosystems and forests, which I do. It's also because I feel responsible for them. And I wonder, what do we owe to our ecosystems? You know, if we're not going to solve these problems, who's going to? And then you get into, you know, a lot of the ways that we solve these problems are at the very least going to be difficult. And sometimes they're going to require us to make really hard decisions. But we do it because it's the right thing to do, because we're responsible. And if we're not going to take care of it, no one is. Okay, so when moving into sort of the control section here, what are, you know, sort of thinking about what do we do about it and how do we do that? The most important thing is to be proactive. So the sooner that you identify where these plants are, if you identify them when they're just, you know, a couple of plants, you can eliminate them really easily before it becomes a problem. The worse it gets, the fewer options that you have, and usually the less palatable those options are going to be. So where there aren't many invasive plants, what I often see is that people are like, well, this isn't a problem, who cares? It's not impacting me in any way. And then when the invasive plant problem gets really bad, they say, well, I can't deal with this. This is too hard, right? And so it's important to recognize that if you have these plants in an ecosystem that you work with or volunteer in or own, you need to take care of them. If you have one plant, you have a problem. And it's not going to get any easier. They're not going to go away on their own. They're only going to get worse, and no one's going to deal with them unless you do. So the easiest way, and by far like best way to control these, if you can, is by what we call mechanical methods. So mechanical methods are non-chemical methods. These are ways of controlling the plants that basically, you know, they're just not using chemicals. So examples of this are hand pulling them out by hand, where you really need to make sure to pull out the whole root system. This hand pulling, if you can do it, hand pulling is the best way to control invasive plants. The problem is you can't hand pull out invasive plants effectively unless they're really small. In a lot of cases, if they're even a little bit too big, you're just going to break off a root fragment and leave it in the soil. It's just going to sprout again. It's going to be like you didn't do anything. You can use tools like weed wrenches, which can make it a little bit more effective and allow you to get some bigger plants. But usually when the plants get larger, or with certain species of plants, it's not effective. Girdling is the process of cutting just a really thin cut, like 1/4 of an inch deep around the circumference of a plant. The idea is that will starve the plant, and that I've heard about it anecdotally working on buckthorn. I've never actually seen it work. Burning is something that people are really interested in right now. I've only heard about it being effective on Japanese barberry, which is that species in the background. Japanese barberry has these basal buds close to the ground, and I guess if you burn them off, you can kill the plant that way. Cutting, so just cutting down a plant, an invasive plant, and thinking it's not going to grow back, almost never works. I call it just making it mad, especially with stuff like buckthorn. You're just going to take that one stem and just turn it into a gajillion little sprouts that will sprout vigorously and instantly, and it'll be like you didn't do anything. I've heard about some creative cutting techniques where especially on buckthorn, they'll cut it high, like 3 feet off the ground, which will cause it to not sprout from the base of the plant, but to sprout sort of from the side and the top. And then you can come through, cut off all the sprouts that come off, in the next few months, and cut it a little bit lower, and then just keep on cutting off the sprouts, cutting it a little bit lower, and then eventually you'll sort of antagonize it to death. And then smothering is another technique that works, that has worked. I've never seen it work, but apparently works sometimes on species like Knotweed, which is a creeping plant, mostly out of people's gardens, but also sometimes like in floodplains. Here in Richmond, lots of it in the floodplains and around our Riverwalk trails, and in Burlington in the Intervale, it's pretty much a carpet of pure goutweed everywhere. Smothering can work. Usually you use like thick plastic and cover it, and it takes a few years. I've tried it on Japanese knotweed, and I was not impressed with it. The Japanese knotweed burst through the plastic and completely grew back over the top of the plastic. It was incredible. So the pros and cons of mechanical treatment. The pros are no chemicals, which is great. Like, most of us don't want to use chemicals if we don't have to. The cons are it's physically intense. It's intense from a time perspective. So it will require, any one of these methods will require years of repeated visits. If you want to kill a plant by cutting it to death, you'll probably, like a buckthorn, plan on cutting it once every month of the growing season for 10 years, and you'll probably kill it. Japanese knotweed, don't even bother. Even with hand pulling, in many cases, you're going to leave fragments of root in the soil, and you're going to have to keep on pulling. So if you're not willing to invest a lot of time, you're not going to get it done. So while mechanical treatment can be effective, and I've seen examples on a very small scale of it being effective, I've never seen a large scale example of an entirely mechanical approach being effective, ever. And I used to have a couple examples of that, but then people told me to stop using their examples because it didn't end up working. So what I say usually is that, this is sort of dire, but in most cases, again, except for if you have a few plants, if you have a small area, if you're like really want to spend the time that it takes to go back to that area again and again and again, you can totally kill invasive plants, most of them, using mechanical methods. But for most people, I say you can kill them that way, but you won't, because most people can never invest the time and the energy that it takes to control an infestation, or they'll just control one little pocket of these plants and then ignore the massive infestation that's all around them. So again, appropriate for small localized infestations, appropriate for small plants when plants are physically small. Certain plants respond well to different types of treatments. I know that people down in northern Addison County have had a lot of success digging parsnip. So they'll go out at dusk and they use this tool called a Parsnip Predator, which is this specially modified shovel that they'll use for digging out these parsnips. And after a few years of doing that, they can really get ahead of it and deal with those parsnips. If you're a landowner who just has a lot of time and you just want to do it this way, you can totally do it that way. And again, I have seen examples of small scale success. Cutting, I have not seen examples of success in that case. That's sort of the easiest thing that everybody wants to do, but it just doesn't really work. What I say is that invasive treatment is a capacity issue. So we know we want to control these plants. And what you need to do as a landowner is to be realistic about the amount of time and the amount of energy that you have. Because there's, if you decide, this is especially meaningful as we start to talk about chemical treatment. But if you decide you don't want to use chemical treatment and you have this really advanced infestation, you need to be aware of what that means if you want to deal with that infestation, and you want to, sort of bring your forest back, help it be healthy again. It's going to require a lot of time and a lot of energy. And if you're going to hire someone to do it, it's going to cost a lot of money. So you just need to be realistic. And what most people do who aren't willing to consider chemical treatment is they just they end up giving up and just letting the invasives go. So hand pulling, again, this is my favorite treatment method, and this is what our first the first thing we want to try all the time is hand pulling if we can. So you want to make sure to pull out the whole plant and the whole root system, hang it up to dry. That's a weed wrench. And there are actually weed wrenches that you can borrow if you live in Williston. Williston has a weed wrench or two. And we have a weed wrench here at the Essex office of the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation on West Street that we lend out. Spring's a great time for doing that. And with the weed wrench, you can actually get some bigger plants, but just keep in mind that, especially with bigger plants, you're gonna leave some fragments or roots in the soil. So mark where you were working, maybe with a piece of fluorescent flagging tape or something like that, so that you can return to that site again and again and continue to pull out those sprouts. And just plan on, if you're gonna do it this way, just plan on, you're gonna wanna check on it multiple times a year, and you're gonna wanna come back for multiple years. And if you set that expectation, then that you'll just be like, this is what we're doing, and you'll take care of it. So chemical control, and obviously this is really a divisive thing, and this is certainly something that I've struggled with in my own life. When is this appropriate? And it's challenging because, a lot of us folks that care about biodiversity and care about our ecosystems are also the kind of people who don't want to be spraying chemicals everywhere, and are also people that have a negative association with a lot of these chemicals, especially glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, and for good reason, right? The way that these chemicals are applied in the context of agriculture is really intense, and it's being broadcast sprayed over huge acreages with the goal to suppress native biodiversity. Now, the interesting thing about the way that I think about using chemicals now to control invasive plants is that we're using this herbicide as a restoration tool to do the exact opposite of that. We're using it as a restoration tool to protect native biodiversity. We're sort of like turning it around, we're using the thing that we thought of as an evil thing as something to actually support really good, positive things. And it can be done well. And for all the reasons that I mentioned about just it being so much more effective than a lot of those other techniques, this is what almost every conservation organization in Vermont uses all the time, to some extent. Not every single time, but most of the time, because it works. And because our ecosystems are important enough that we need to do what works to protect them from this. So there's a few different methods, what I call a cut stump treatment, a foliar spray, a snip and drip, and glyphosate. Again, that chemical, most widely known herbicide in the world, is by far the most environmentally responsible herbicide on the market. You can buy it over the counter in a hardware store. Also used somewhat nefariously in some contexts, and this is not one of them. When is chemical treatment appropriate? So larger infestations. So if it's more than a few plants, sometimes on larger plants that you can't pull up by hand, certain species are really difficult to either pull up or to treat using other methods. So the examples of that are Japanese barberry, multiflora rose, Japanese knotweed, bittersweet. And again, remembering that controlling invasives is a capacity issue, landowners who don't have the time, the energy, the physical stamina, maybe the money to deal with this problem, but they want to deal with it. So I now use this tool. I carry this tool here on the left. It's called a Buckthorn Blaster. I should have stock in this company because there's all kinds of goofy pictures of me posing with it, and I tell people about it all the time. It's a 4-ounce bingo dauber, like you'd use to stamp a bingo card, and you fill it up with herbicide concentrate and a dye, and you stamp it on the cut stumps of invasive plants. So I carry with me all the time now. And again, I should say that I am a person, I eat all organic food. I'm not trying to use chemicals in most contexts of my life, except for I feel responsible for dealing with this problem. And this is the only way that I have found that actually works. So super targeted, super minimal. I have a little folding handsaw that I carry in my vest all the time, and my Buckthorn Blaster. I cut these stems, and I just apply, dabbing with a sponge tip of that Buckthorn Blaster, apply a microscopic fraction of an ounce of herbicide to the surface of this stump, covering the stump, and it translocates throughout the plant and it kills it. I can treat with 2 ounces of herbicide in that Buckthorn Blaster hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of plants. I've done commercial treatment with them where it took me basically 6 hours to use all the herbicide in that thing. It's really targeted. And so one of the things I really like about this technique is that, so it's using herbicide as a restoration tool, but recognizing that that doesn't mean that we have to be comfortable with it in any context, right? We don't have to be like, herbicide's cool no matter what. We want to use it super minimally, and we want to use it in a super targeted way. And this is absolutely the best way to do it. Something that happens sometimes to me is that I'll be out walking through my woods in Bear Island, and I'll find one Japanese barberry. And I know from experience that I cannot pull out that Japanese barberry by hand without leaving a big chunk of root in the ground. And I know that I'm never going to find it again. And so what I do, instead of beating my head against the wall and waiting for that to become a bigger infestation when I don't find it again, is I cut it and I treat the stem with a teeny tiny little dab of herbicide, and I know that it's dead, and away I go. A foliar spray is something that's even more challenging for people to accept. Here's a really bad infestation of Japanese barberry in Westford. It's a much lower concentration. So with the cut stump application, you're talking about 20 to 40% active ingredient. Here you're talking about 2 to 4%, and it's applied to leaves during the growing season, which is like June through September. The times when this is appropriate or warranted is when you have plants with smaller plants with a dense infestation. So I had, for instance, acres and acres and acres and acres of these bittersweet sprouts. Or if you have some of these specific plants, especially barberry and multiflora rose, which have lots of teeny tiny little stems. You need to apply to the surface of 75% of the total leaf area. So there's actually, even if you accidentally hit a native plant, which does not happen a lot, it doesn't necessarily even kill that plant. So what I would do is I would be spraying Japanese barberry, and I would see a little red oak, and I would put my foot up to it and lean it out of the way, and I would spray the barberry, and then I would lean the little red oak back, and it would be fine. There's a really good example, if you guys are interested in seeing how surgical and targeted a foliar spray can be. We did this kind of treatment at the La Platte Headwaters Town Forest in Heinsberg. If you go to their Gilman Road trailhead, you can walk in and you can go to this area where there's all this pine blowdown, all this regeneration, and Japanese barberry growing with really dense understory of all these other species, and only the barberry is dead. Or I'm sorry, only the buckthorn is dead. Pretty incredible stuff. But you don't want to apply, again, we don't want to be spraying, it's not like a fog blower. We don't want to be blowing it across the landscape. We're talking about super targeted minimal application to individual plants. And you're not applying when it's rainy, and you're not applying when it's windy. It's really, really important when you're using this to be careful. There's also a ton of hybrid approaches. So the goal is not to, so I talk about using herbicide a lot to people because in my experience, that's how we actually get this done. That's how we actually deal with these invasive plants. And I have not seen mechanical treatment be effective in most cases. And I've seen incredible results from the super targeted minimal use of herbicide. But herbicide is not the goal. I don't like herbicide. I recognize that it's a tool that we need to have in order to solve this problem. And if we're going to solve this problem, which is advanced across our landscape, in our ecosystems, herbicide is going to be part of that. And so we can, deny that and think of all these reasons why it shouldn't be part of that, or we can think about how to use it as a restoration tool in a really, really specific way to protect native biodiversity. But that doesn't mean that we have to be wedded to that one treatment. So there's a number of hybrid approaches. One hybrid approach that I often use is that I'll do hand pulling, and when I break off a root, I find the root in the soil and I treat it with the Buckthorn Blaster. So I know that it won't resprout. But I'm most of the time I'm just hand pulling, but it just allows me that extra insurance. Another example is doing hand pulling with smaller stems, and then when you run into your occasional larger plant, doing cut stump treatment because you can't pull it out, and you're not going to just rail against that plant and like hurt your back and break your fingernails. You're going to just deal with it in a way that works and doesn't wear you out and allows you to keep on pulling all those other little plants. Other examples are, cutting some, I've seen people like go through where the invasives are really dense with like a brush saw, so like a weed whacker with a blade on it, and just cutting everything down. And then when they resprout, then foliar spraying the resprout. So instead of spraying way up high where there's a chance that the herbicide will spray everywhere, spraying way down low to the ground. This is a technique that we're going to try at the Catamount Community Forest in Williston, which had some areas of really, really dense buckthorn. We did some habitat management and we ended up grinding down a lot of that buckthorn. And so now it's going to resprout and we're going to be able to spray it when it's an inch tall. And so it'll cause much, much less collateral damage than it would if we were spraying it way up high and getting herbicide everywhere. So again, what the tool that we use is not important. What's important is that we're controlling the species. And so if we can find other methods that allow us to move away from chemical control, we should use those. But in my experience, being able to accept or deal with the concept of chemical control is really important. In many contexts, when we think about managing our ecosystems, we need to do the right thing, even when it's hard. And so there's a thing where it's like, you know, we're used to having pretty much everything we want. You know, we go to the store, we can buy whatever we want. You know, as a landowner, you have all this freedom on your own land. But there are instances, and you know, other examples of this are like, you know, cutting trees sometimes to produce local renewable resources, and you know, make our forests more complex and diverse and resilient. Killing deer where there's an overpopulation of deer. There's a lot of different examples of stuff that's hard, but it's the right thing to do. Controlling invasives is always going to be hard, no matter how you do it. It's going to be time consuming, it's going to be expensive, it might require us to make tough choices like deciding to use herbicide, which we never thought in the world that we would be okay with, but we need to do it because it's the right thing to do. There's a few different resources. The most comprehensive guide to dealing with or to invasives in general, not necessarily to really nuanced strategies for controlling them, but to the invasives themselves, is the Nature Conservancy's, it's called the Vermont Landowner's Guide to Invasive Terrestrial Plant Management. For those of you with, you know, more than a few acres, if you own it, you may be eligible for the EQIP program, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which is administered by the NRCS. If you're interested in that program, I can send you some information on it. It requires you to have a forest management plan, but then you may be eligible for some funding to do invasive treatment for basically as part of a wildlife habitat program. And another resource that you should always use is your county forester. So county foresters we're just this resource that's just here to help you out with figuring out how to manage your ecosystems. And so use us. VTinvasives.org, that's a picture of that spotted knotweed that I was talking about. Really pretty flower, but I know a couple people who are really railing against these things. VTinvasives.org, good site for everything invasive. So it's about invasive plants, but also invasive organisms and pests like the emerald ash borer. And we can talk about that if you guys are interested, but rules and regs for herbicide application in Vermont, if you're gonna do it, you gotta follow the label. You can apply some herbicides on your own land. On someone else's land, you need to be a licensed applicator, which is not hard to become, or to be under the supervision of a licensed applicator. So with that, I would love to take some questions. I know that that's a lot, and I know that also just to, you know, with individual plants, the approach is really different, and I just sort of gave a general overview of how to do it. From Chad, I see, would Buckthorn Blaster work on Japanese knotweed? With Japanese knotweed, I will say, of all the invasive plants that I have encountered, Japanese knotweed is the hardest to kill. And I have, when I was a consultant, tried all kinds of stuff, and I actually ended up talking to this really sort of locally famous invasive control guy years ago. And I was like, how do you kill Japanese knotweed? And he was like, did you, you like sprayed it and you sprayed it and you sprayed it for like 3 years and you got it like 95% killed. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly what happened. He was like, that's as good as I've ever done. The way to kill Japanese knotweed is to do the snip and drip. So to cut, same thing with Phragmites actually, to cut them and to drop concentrated herbicide. I can't tell you the exact amount or concentration off the top of my head because I don't do it very frequently, to drop herbicide into the hollow of each individual cane in an entire infestation. And I would use like a little dropper. I have used the Buckthorn Blaster, but a dropper would be a more precise tool. Bittersweet, I would definitely cut and use herbicide on the surface of the stump, again, because remembering that they have a propensity for having this really robust root system, and so pulling them out is probably not going to be effective. So I would cut them, which is going to initially kill them, and then I would treat the surface of the stump, which is going to translocate throughout the root system. With bittersweet and with common buckthorn and with a few other plants, there's going to be a frustrating moment, no matter what you do. There's going to be this frustrating moment where they tend to have seeds that are viable in the soil for a number of years. So you're going to kill the plants, and then the next year it's going to be like more plants than ever. It's going to be all these little plants, but luckily those are not root sprouts. Those are individual new plants that are sprouting from seeds. And so you could cultivate those with like a circle hoe. You could scuff them up and you'd kill them. They have no root system to speak of. And if you do that, it might be those seeds can persist for a couple of years, but eventually you'll get them. And the most important thing with most of these plants is, if you're going to sort of prioritize how you deal with them, it's to get the biggest plants that are throwing the most seeds first, because then you're sort of stopping the bleeding. So then get the big ones, you're stopping the new introduction of seeds, and then you can deal with all sort of like the backlog. And those big ones are going to be the ones that are in hedgerows and, in some of the young forests sometimes, but mostly on edges of stuff. On my land, it's, I'm on the edge. I have two giant edges that there's nothing I can do anything about. One of them is I'm alongside the highway, which is just raining invasives onto my land all the time. And the other is that I have a power line corridor running, a double power line corridor actually, which is about 150 feet wide running through my property, which is just a sea of invasives. Let's see. Debbie asked about poison ivy. Debbie, I do not know what to do about poison ivy because it's one of these plants that it's definitely like a climate change winner. It definitely seems to be responding positively to climate change, but it is native. And honestly, I have treated it on my own land before because I get it really, really bad and it's been sort of taking over, but I don't know if with these native plants that can behave invasively sometimes, which poison ivy definitely does, I'm conflicted about it, about how I feel about treating a plant like that. But you would have to, you'd have to foliar spray it. That'd be the only way to do it, because it'd be really hard because they do have little teeny tiny little woody stems, which I guess you could treat, but you'd have to suit up so you wouldn't get covered in poison ivy. Larry asked if there's any value
Ethan, I've also heard of using.
Sorry, go ahead, Eric.
I've also heard of using goats on. I've heard of using goats on the poison ivy too.
That's a good point, and I should have talked about goats. So that's something that definitely there's a lot of interest in right now, is having people who like a rent-a-goat situation where they pasture goats in these areas. And there are some goat farmers who are interested in it. You could charge by the day, and it could be a good little market. And goats are sort of like chickens, where they can just sort of like eat crud all day and still be really big and healthy. But here's the problem with goats, and with any critter like that, is that they're going to eat everything. And so unless you have an infestation that is 100% buckthorn, the problem is that you're not going to be able to, you're going to sort of reduce everything down to zero again. And then what you might get back is more buckthorn. And it could be a good way to sort of deal with an existing problem and get it a little bit less intense. But as far as like putting them in the woods or something like that, one of the benefits of using a cut stump application or hand pulling or any of these other techniques really even a foliar spray, is that you can actually like weed around native stuff. So with a lot of these species, one of the ways that you're going to deal with them in the long term is that you're going to shade them out, and that's not going to, you know, they can still grow in the shade, but they're going to be much less dense in the shade in most cases. And so your ability to recruit a forest of native species around them is an asset. And so, you know, you can kill those invasive plants and not kill native plants, and those native plants will hopefully, you know, get above them and provide some shade, which will do something to deter them. But the goats is going to be like, here's an area that is 100% all stuff we don't want, clean it out. But there are situations like that, and when that would be totally appropriate. Let's see here. Yeah, Eric said, so yeah, Sean or Shana asked, where can I find the weed wrench in Williston? I think they have it at the Williston town office. I think Melinda Scott might be the person to contact about that. She's a conservation planner in Williston. And also asked, what's the difference between Buckthorn Blaster and Roundup? So the blaster, like you said, Eric, is a dauber. It's the tool. It costs $6. You can get it on, it's like landscape-restoration.com. Costs $6. It's a tool, but you got to buy the herbicide for it. And you want herbicide concentrate. And actually, while I'm thinking about it, I'm gonna put in the chat. I have a video specifically about me using the Buckthorn Blaster, which I will put in the chat. Hold on. That's me talking about it. No, thank you. Okay. So that's on my YouTube channel. There's some other webinars about invasives that are on there as well. Vince, Bulldog, you got your hand raised. Do you want to ask something? Maybe that was an accident.
It was an accident. Thank you for calling on me, though.
Okay.
I'm loving this.
Great. Robin asked, if you hand pull plants, what's the best way to dispose of them? So the normal joke is you pull these plants and then you hang them up in a tree, roots up, or you somehow get that root system off the ground as a warning to other invasive plants if they think of colonizing that area. The reason for that really is so that they don't reroot. I don't worry a lot about that. And one thing that I would say is that, you know, with working with landowners who are doing management in any context on their own land, one of the things that I really try and do is stop making them stop doing stuff that takes a lot of time and doesn't do that much good. And one of those things is like neatly piling brush. So if you're dealing with a lot of big honeysuckle, for instance, or buckthorn, yes, there is a possibility that honeysuckle can sprout. Like if you lay it on the ground, it can sprout, put down what we call adventitious roots into the ground, and that, you know, just the stem of the honeysuckle can sprout, but it usually doesn't. And honestly, what you should be doing is just dumping those plants wherever you can, and 99% of them are going to be just fine. And you, instead of spending all the time and energy and again, like hurting your back, stacking them, you should move on and control more invasive plants, would be my advice. But if you can, if it's easy to do so and you pull those plants out, you know, with the example of woody invasive plants, try and get them off the ground if you can. Sometimes I'll throw them up on a stump or something, you know, on a rock or something like that, just so the root system can dry out and they won't reroot. Some invasive plants, and Japanese knotweed is a good example of this, you can't do that with because they will root from anything. And so, and I think another example of that is goutweed, and garlic mustard is another example of that. Garlic mustard can make seeds. If you cut garlic mustard and it's laying on the ground, it can make seeds as a cut stem laying on the ground. So with that stuff, what you should do is you should pull it up, you should bag it, and there's some techniques for drying it out, or you can bring it to that compost facility on Redmond Road in Williston. They will take that stuff And there might be, if you're in another part of the state, you know, there might be a commercial composting facility where their system gets hot enough that they can digest that stuff. Let's see, I'm going to go all the way to the top of the chat and just try and bang out as many of these as I can. Yeah, so Terry asked if there's a native bittersweet. There is, much less common, sort of like the native honeysuckle. Tim asked, who could one hire to identify invasives on a large piece of property? A consulting forester, a county forester, other? I know that, so there are people who like do this, who do invasive plant removal, who do landscape restoration. And if you're interested, I'd be happy to connect you with, give you the list of them that I have. I have a pretty comprehensive list. And consulting foresters are another really good example of people who come out. If you aren't able to identify them in your own woodlot, you want to know how bad the problem is, you want to know what options you have. A consulting forester is a good tool. You have to pay them. Another, you know, the cheapest and easiest option is to learn yourself, or to have someone teach you, and to learn to identify them. We're actually about to, not super soon, but in the next couple of months, there are 2 times of the year when it's really especially easy to tell where the invasives are in your woodlot: spring and fall. And the reason is because they're the first thing, almost the first thing to get leaves in the spring, and almost the last thing to have leaves in the fall. And so I'll go out with people in that time, and I call it like looking for the green haze. So you look into the understory of the woodlot, and it's just this like haze of green, and all that green in that, you know, early spring or late fall forest is invasive plants, pretty much. And so that's a good way to sort of get a sense for what you have, and almost all of them do that. But yeah, a consulting forester or one of those invasive plant control contractors would be someone to call for that. Tim, yeah, and that Inaturalist app Eric mentioned is also a good way. Tim asks, this is a good question, Tim. Of the common invasives, which 1 or 2 pose the greatest threat in Vermont? I mean, I think that the one that's probably the scariest to me, which I don't deal with that much, is Japanese knotweed. And the reason for that is because it's almost impossible to kill, and it's really spreads really easily, and it also has remarkable influences over our aquatic habitats and the way that our streams work, the way that animals use our stream buffers, and water quality and other stuff like that. It has sort of all these like really pervasive influences that are really scary, that influence, you know, sort of when you alter the vegetation by the side of a stream, you don't just alter the vegetation, you alter the way that stream works and the way it moves and the way it behaves. And especially in the context of, you know, altered storm frequency and severity, which we're looking at right now, it's a problem. And, you know, and pollution of stuff like Lake Champlain. I think that that's the one that's the scariest to me, Tim. But in Chittenden County specifically, it's in the woods. It's those 3. It's shrub honeysuckle, Japanese barberry, and common buckthorn. Common buckthorn is probably the one that, if people in parts of Chittenden County have anything in common, it's that they know what buckthorn is and they don't like it. Let's see here. Terry asked when you can start using a Buckthorn Blaster and doing that cut stump application. So now is starting, I would say, March and through May is the only time of the year that you can't do it. So you can do it all winter, you can do it all summer. The best time to do it is late summer, like August through October, because that's when the plants are really like translocating stuff down into the root system. So they're going to pull that herbicide down in, and it's going to work better. But what I say is that most other times, like whenever you're out in the woods and you have the time to deal with it, is a pretty good time, except for the next 2 months. So yeah, so I would say when you get into June, go ahead, start doing it. And for most people, again, if you're doing it yourself on your own land, you just got to do it when you can do it. And don't, you know, if you try and pack it all into those 2 months, you're just, you know, it's going to be harder to get it done. Rick asked, does it work to remove a backhoe to remove barberry? Many of mine can be reached from the edges. Yeah, that would work. You know, many of these plants, like there are mechanical options that you can use to really try and remove the root systems of bigger plants. Like I've heard about people using a winch or chaining up around to them with a tractor and pulling them out. And those are obviously much more intensive, much more soil disturbance, which could potentially cause more invasives. But, you know, ones that are like easily accessible, you have way more options. I mean, you could, if it's just on the edge of your yard, you know, and you don't mind before dinner when you have a minute going out to cut it again, you could just, you know, easily cut a plant to death just because it's right there. It's more those more remote, inaccessible ones that are harder to get. But yeah, you could totally yank out big buckthorns or barberries or whatever using a backhoe. Some people were saying that goats like poison ivy. I've heard that as well. Marlene asked, should residential burning bush be removed or just keep it controlled? This is tough. So a lot of it's tough because, you know, you'll go out in people's forests with them and like point out invasives and they totally get it. And they're like, yes, I understand why this is a problem. Yep, we're going to deal with it. And then you go to the front of their house and there's that treasured barberry, you know, or the burning bush or whatever. It's very hard to tell them that, you know, you should get rid of it. Because, you know, even if what people will say a lot of times is like, you know, it seems like that tree is like, or that plant is staying pretty contained, but what you're not accounting for is the fact that it's throwing seed everywhere. And the fact that you don't see little burning bushes all over your yard doesn't mean that there aren't little burning bushes all over your neighbor's forest or in a wetland or wherever. You know, I think that one of the really tricky things about invasive plants is that it's a problem that knows no property boundaries, can easily, you know, one person being negligent can easily affect many other people. And so even with people, what I found actually with, you know, folks who don't care about it, they're like, whatever, this doesn't matter to me. They do care about being a good neighbor, and they do want to, you know, be a good member of their community and be a good neighbor, and, you know, not sort of degrade the forests of their neighbors. And that's something that we need to consider. So, like, you know, the straight answer to that question is yes, you should kill that burning bush in your front yard. Yes, you should get rid of that Japanese barberry in your front yard. Even if you think it's contained, it's not. And even if you don't see those seeds, it doesn't mean that they're not making them, which is tough, I know. But there's a lot of really nice native plants that do similar things. There's all kinds of these cool native plants that have all kinds of different attributes and aren't going to take over the world. That, you know, there's all sorts of neat resources about how to find native plants that are similarly beautiful and have good ornamental attributes like those non-native plants, but are native and, you know, and work better with our ecosystems. And Betsy said, why not spring for the Buckthorn Blaster? Thanks, Betsy. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I don't see any more questions, but yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is, if anything else comes up, how about this? I'll send you all the recording. I'll send everybody that registered for this class. I'll send you the recording or the link to it on my YouTube page. And if other questions come up from this, or if you need anything else, please do reach out and let me know. And also, if you live in Vermont and you live in a different county, please feel free to reach out to your county forester, because I'm certainly not the last word on any of this stuff. Different county foresters have different approaches and maybe some more localized information about what's going on in your neck of the woods. So definitely check with them as well. And with that, I think I'm going to say good night.